Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's event. My name's Charlie Day. I'm the Project Director for the Carlton Connect initiative, which is one of your hosts for tonight, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to Lab 14. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet tonight, the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the history of the site on which we are meeting, the former Royal Women's Hospital. It's a place of great joy for those who were born here or had children here, and I know there's probably some of those in the audience tonight, but also a place of great challenge for those who confronted serious illness on this site. It was also a birthplace for great innovations in the history of women's health, and I know it's been a significant site in the history of Victoria, and we're very much hoping that it will be a significant site in the future of the state of Victoria and of Australia. I'm just going to say a few words about the Carlton Connect initiative and then hand over to your host for tonight, Nick. The Carlton Connect initiative is really about bringing together talented people from business, government and of course academia and the community to tackle some of the grand challenges associated with the sustainability and resilience of our society. It's an initiative very much rooted in innovation as a core value. Innovation's a very much overused word, I think, sometimes, but for me it really means fresh thinking that creates value. It's all about fresh thinking that creates value. And historically, I think Australians have sometimes been prone to think of innovation as something that starts with innovation, like research in an ivory tower, get passed through a large corporate and then turns up as a product in a marketplace. But our view, I guess, here at Carlton Connect is very much that innovation is a non-linear process. It doesn't follow a neat pathway from invention through to product. It needs input from and creative collisions between lots of different sectors. And it often generates processes as much as products, or improvements to processes as much as products. And so as we're thinking about the future of this hospital site, we want to make it a place where some of those collisions can take place, where some of that non-linear interactions between people from different sectors can take place and drive innovation. And we think that that's a great way to tackle some of the big challenges that we confront as a nation. And tonight, I think, is a great example of that. What we're going to be hearing from tonight is some really great innovations from an industry in mining, which perhaps is traditionally conceived of as being an innovator in a technological sense. But I think here tonight we have some great innovation in other senses, which has genuinely created value for all of those people who've been involved. And tonight, I think we want to hear about that, explore that, and I hope you will take away inspirations for how you could take that style of innovation into the work that you're doing in the many sectors that you're doing. That's all I wanted to say by way of introduction and setting the scene. I'll hand over now to Nick Thompson, who's going to be our MC for tonight, to introduce the remaining speakers. Nick.
Thank you, Charlie, and good evening, everyone. So it's a great pleasure tonight to be able to welcome our panellists to the Carlton Connect building. This was an event that was sort of conceived late last year in the sort of hustle and bustle of organising a conference, and we couldn't pull it off in time because people weren't going to be around. But the stars have aligned, and we've been able to sort of bring it together tonight. So without further ado, you all really know why you're here and the sort of the issues that we're going to be looking at. So I'm going to introduce our panel first of all. The first speaker tonight will be Professor Marcia Langton, Order of Australia. She is the Professor and Foundation Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne's Melbourne School of Population and Global Health. She's the author of numerous peer-reviewed research publications and books across a range of disciplines and issues. She's a significant national and global actor at the forefront of Indigenous people's rights and access to justice. In addition to everything else she does, she's been a pioneer in an increasingly innovative and sophisticated engagement and negotiation with the minerals industry in pursuit of Indigenous economic development. She's joined here tonight by a colleague and friend of hers, Bruce Harvey, who's an adjunct professor at the Sustainable Minerals Institute of the University of Queensland, 38 years worldwide field experience in the mining industry, and from a very early period in that engagement, developed an affinity for working with land-connected peoples as Exploration General Manager for Northern Australia. He established Rio Tinto's first exploration access agreements on Aboriginal land. Bruce now runs a Resolution 88, which is specialised in social licence, and we're super lucky that Bruce is here because he's actually flown in from Mongolia. Joining Bruce and Marcia is Damien Ardagh, who's the Indigenous Development Manager with Fortescue Metals Group. In recent years, Damien has been driving training and employment opportunities for Indigenous peoples in the minerals sector, as well as working closely on the Forest Review. We're also grateful Damien has been able to extract himself from Western Australia to be with us tonight and gratefully acknowledge his support and enthusiasm and indeed the support of the Fortescue Metals Group in putting on tonight's panel. So, how are we going to run it? Tonight, each of our panellists is going to give some opening remarks, some commentary and some perspectives on the journey from conflict to collaboration at the intersection of Indigenous economic development and the resource industry. After these opening remarks, we'll settle into a moderated panel discussion and time permitting, we'll provide some opportunities for questions from the floor before refreshments will underpin a further chance for social interaction. So without further ado, I welcome Professor Langton to the stage.
Thank you to Carlton Connect and our good colleagues there, and thanks to all of you for coming this evening. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people, and also elders in the room from neighbouring nations. And I see some young Indigenous people here. Thank you for coming. But I also acknowledge all of you for showing an interest in this very important evening of discussion on essentially Indigenous economic development and the role of the mining industry in that endeavour. So first of all, I want to point out to you that there are copies available of my recent monograph published by the Minerals Council of Australia, From Conflict to Cooperation, after which this seminar is titled Transformations and Challenges in the Engagement Between the Australian Minerals Industry and Australian Indigenous Peoples. So if you want to know what I've been doing for the last 40 years, this is a 10,000-word summary. And it's a very important publication because the Minerals Council of Australia has adopted, in a way, this account, although it's my personal account and they take no responsibility for my views, but they have taken the risk of publishing it, and I think that's a big step to have the MCA publish it. It's downloadable from the MCA website, but we have copies, so if you want a copy, just let me know. Now, I've been here at the University of Melbourne for more than 15 years, and I brought with me from the Northern Territory when I arrived here a great concern that we continue the work that we started in the Northern Territory more than 20 years ago, well, more than 30 years ago actually, of getting intelligent, sophisticated engagement between the mining industry and Indigenous people. You'll find out from reading this monograph that it was highly conflictual. I don't tell all the war stories, but you know, there are many war stories to tell. Now, today, we have a very sophisticated engagement. That's what I aim for, that's what we've got. Now, it's tricky, it's difficult, you have to know what you're talking about. Most people don't. That's why there's a handful of experts in the country who know how to engage in this space. So there are several sectors involved. One is, of course, the native title sector. Then, of course, there's the cultural heritage sector. There's the environmental conservation sector. There's the mining or the minerals industry and related sectors, mining services and so on, energy. And then, of course, there's the research community. So I was fortunate enough, with my background in the Northern Territory, to find some wonderful partners in conducting research. So over the last 10 years, with the assistance of industry partners, we've been able to secure 3 Australian Research Council linkage grants, which involve industry partnerships to solve problems of interest to the nation. So I want to acknowledge my great friend and mentor, Bruce Harvey, who years ago in the Northern Territory approached me as a young geologist in exploration, and we became very good friends, and I adopted him as my mentor, And he even came to one of my book prize nights here in Melbourne. And so Rio Tinto, from the beginning, backed what we were doing because of their policy of intelligent engagement with traditional owners. I also want to acknowledge Fortescue Metals Group, founded by Andrew Forrest. So Andrew likewise has been one of my mentors. They're very different personalities, I assure you. But I worked with Andrew on his forest review of Indigenous employment and training. I've been giving him advice as a friend since he started the Australian Employment Covenant, Generation 1 and other initiatives to improve Indigenous employment. But more importantly, I want to say that there have been many partners in this project over the last 10 years. The Australian government has been a partner from the beginning. Our first partner was ATSIC, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island Commission, Department of Prime Minister Cabinet these days. But we've also had help from other government departments. IATSIS gave us our first grant to get the interactive website happening. The University of Melbourne has been absolutely wonderful to me. Partners across the universities, Santos and Woodside have been partners as well. But this website is an award-winning website that provides to the world, at the expense of the taxpayer, an interactive database of agreements. So explore this site, explore our publications, our symposia, our video symposia. Now, and the results of our research. There have been many books and so on. We started many years ago thinking, well, look at this. Since the introduction of the Native Title Act, there's been a flurry of negotiating under the terms of the Native Title Act, with the result that agreements have been produced. Then with the 1998 amendments to the Native Title Act, we got the Indigenous Land Use Agreements provision in the Native Title Act, which is actually the kind of silver lining on a very dark cloud. Those were the days of blanket extinguishment of native title, when there was, you know, a second round of general hysteria about native title. But the silver cloud was the Indigenous Land Use Agreements provision. And out of that provision, we've now got around 2,000 agreements. Okay, on this website we have 1,881 agreements. It's not entirely up to date, although young Alice here does her very best to make sure that it is. And we have agreements from other countries as well. And you can go to Indigenous Land Use Agreements, just put it into the searchable website. You'll find all of the Indigenous Land Use Agreements. There are over 1,000. They're binding contracts that bind the parties, and in some cases the Australian government, and so in some cases they look like modern treaties. That development meant that we were able to think about how to develop this website. So we brought in a group of experts to help us develop this website, and the result was this searchable website that's won many awards, is regularly searched by, for instance, commercial investors. So for instance, I just clicked on mining and minerals, and you can see the list goes on and on and on and on. And these are binding contracts between Indigenous people and mining companies and other entities in relation to mining, mining services, mining impacts and so on. What we've pushed for is what the World Bank and the IMF have pushed for, and that is transparency. We'd like transparency so that everybody knows what are the highest standards and what are the lowest standards, what are our best endeavours, How can we improve the engagement? And the result is that we now have some very sophisticated agreements. They're, I think, the best in the world. Personally, I think they're better than most of the Canadian agreements, or there are one or two Canadian agreements that are outstanding. Frankly, they're better than anything else in the world, except for agreements between sovereign nations and companies. Most people don't understand that because of the background noise from the Green movement, the treaty movement, the sovereignty movement, who would have you believe that the whole area is a disaster. Here are the outcomes, which I've summarised in this monograph. An extraordinary increase in Indigenous employment in the mining industry. Matthew Gray from the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research at the Australian National University and I estimated at the peak of the boom that in the Pilbara alone there were 3,000 Indigenous employees in the mining industry. And if you extrapolate from that across the mining provinces in Australia, it's highly likely that at the peak of the mining boom there were 10,000 Indigenous employees, either in major companies, contractors, you know, like first tier, second tier, third tier companies and Indigenous businesses. Now, of course, the numbers are dropping with the fall in commodity prices. So I note that Fortescue Metals Group has gone from around 1,000 or so to about 600. I don't know what the situation is in Rio Tinto, but we're trying to keep up with that. A group of researchers from our university, from the ANU and Griffith University are working to find the research funds. We have applications into the ARC, of course, to do a study of the Indigenous workforce in the mining industry. Because now, as the boom falls off and people are laid off work, we want to see what happens to the Indigenous workforce. And it's actually a good idea to do it in down times rather than the good times, because I think you get a kind of more normal picture. That's my personal view, but I think that's right. So during the boom times, what we found when we conducted our first trial survey of the Indigenous workforce in Rio Tinto in Western Australia, Rio Tinto Iron Ore in Western Australia, was that those people who had jobs pretty much had closed the gap. So Indigenous employees had closed the gap. We know that because we had, the general sociological question that goes to self-assessed health. The majority were healthy by their own assessment. Another typical question that's rolled out in socio-economic surveys is how much money can you raise in a week? Can you raise $5,000 or $2,000 or whatever in a week for an emergency? The majority could, and in fact the percentage was higher than for the general Australian population. Another one is recreation. Did you have a holiday? Did you leave your hometown? Did you take your family? How much money did you spend? Those Aboriginal employees in the mining industry taking a vacation, and understand this is for the first time ever in their lives, was pretty close to the national figures. So, just on those kind of normal sociological measures, we see the gap closing simply because of employment. And of course, behind that employment, there's training, there's mentoring and many other measures are good policies, and they're all discussed in this monograph. Now, there have been some champions for Indigenous employment. Of course, the first champions for Indigenous employment in the industry came out of Rio Tinto, and I'll mention some names: Paul Wand, Bruce Harvey, Yanina Gawler, Leon Davis, and a number of others. And those champions have passed the baton to others. And the same happened in Fortescue, led by Andrew Forrest. I can't speak for other companies because they are less transparent about their policies and their outcomes. I know Whitehaven Coal's trying to contact me. They want to be transparent. There are other companies that are aiming towards transparency, but I'm not prepared to, speak about the actual outcomes there without hard evidence. I have the hard evidence on both Rio Tinto and Fortescue because of my trial Indigenous workforce studies, and I can say with great confidence that these are the pioneers in producing the largest Aboriginal industrial workforce in modern times in Australia. And this is an extraordinary achievement, given that the Indigenous unemployment rates or disengagement from the workforce rates are so extraordinarily high, and because of suboptimal government policies for 40 years, you know, dreadful training policies. If you want to know more about that, read Creating Parity, the Forest Review report on Indigenous employment and training. It's all explained very clearly there. So my concern now is with measuring the outcomes, particularly employment, but also I hope to move into measuring Indigenous business development. Now, one of the extraordinary outcomes of the boom period was the proliferation of Indigenous contracting companies. So at one stage, I would say 2 or 3 years ago in the Pilbara, there were between 200 and 300 Indigenous contracting companies, some of them entirely Indigenous owned, some of them partly Indigenous owned, some of them joint ventures. In fact, many of them now remain joint ventures with larger companies, Tier 1 and Tier 2 contractors, because of the champions in the majors who ask their subcontractors to do joint ventures with Indigenous businesses. So that's happening across the industry in earth moving, general mining services, catering, but particularly cultural heritage and other mining services. Of course now, many of these small companies are finding it difficult to operate because of the fall in commodity prices. And I should declare my interest. I'm a board member and chairman of partly owned Indigenous companies operating in Western Australia. I'm the chair of one and a board director of the other, and a lot of, you know, the loony left have accused me of being Miss Rio Tinto, etc. I have no shares in Rio Tinto. I have no shares whatsoever, apart from whatever my UniSuper account owns on my behalf. I do have interests in partly Indigenous-owned businesses. We're aiming to get these Indigenous businesses to be 100% owned. One is the Indigenous Construction Resource Group, and the other is Guma Indigenous Construction Resource Group Proprietary Limited. So they're my interests, so please don't believe anything you read in New Matilda, First Nations Telegraph, or National Indigenous Times about me. It is all untrue, and I have defamation lawyers dealing with it. Having declared those private interests, the really important part of my work has been 10 years of leading these three research projects, and as I say, hopefully we'll get an ARC grant. In any case, we will find the money to continue with the Indigenous employment surveys and Indigenous business surveys. A very interesting development. Let me just say a little bit about Indigenous business. Indigenous businesses are 100 times employ Indigenous people at a rate 100 times greater than other employers. So the really critical challenge for any industry now, be it mining, finance, retail, banking, etc., is to create an Indigenous supply chain, because Indigenous businesses will employ Indigenous people, and then the majors can count those Indigenous people in their reconciliation action plans as their outcomes. So what we're moving to now, and I believe it is largely as a result of our project, which created the grounds for rigorous measurement of outcomes. We haven't been able to measure outcomes because of lack of transparency across the industry, not with the majors I've had as partners, but in the rest of the industry, but I believe we'll get there, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But in other industries, I think people are more prepared to be transparent, especially because they have found that the reconciliation action plans have resulted in good outcomes, They're based on a business case. They go to social licence to operate. They go to corporate social responsibility, and they create a good feeling in the community. So you might notice that Westpac leads the pack of the big banks in Australia, for instance, in their engagement with the Indigenous community. And with Australians in general, I might add. Just to give you an example. So the measurement of outcomes of engagement with the Indigenous people is the new black, okay? And I'm glad somebody got that joke. The other interesting development is that we now have announced very recently by Senator Nigel Scullion of the Northern Territory, the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, a new Commonwealth Government procurement policy that puts the target of the federal government spend on infrastructure and services at 3% for the Indigenous businesses. 3% of an annual budget of $39 billion. To date, a suboptimal government procurement policy for Indigenous supply chain was at 0.00 something, so it's not even worth mentioning. I can't even remember the number on the end. And so the outcomes were dismal. This new procurement policy, which results from the Forest Report, will result in, a nice chunk of the economy for the Indigenous business community. So I'm saying to people, for instance, here in Victoria, be it the tunnel or the East-West link, I don't care which, let's get the Indigenous businesses in shape to tender for at least 3%. And there are Indigenous businesses in Victoria that can do that. And I'm also pushing for similar outcomes in Western Australia, the Northern Territory and Queensland. In Queensland, I'm the co-chair of Cape York Partnership, which is a not-for-profit organisation, but one of our units is a little business called Barmer Contracting. Look up Cape York Partnership online. I'm pushing Barmer Contract to ramp up their business opportunities. I would like to see Barmer Contracting grow with its MOU with the company I'm involved with, ICRG, and take a chunk of the major development of the Peninsula Development Road, for instance. So there's a group of us across Australia who are taking our know-how to the people to show them how to grow Indigenous business and Indigenous employment through procurement from both the private and the public sector. If you want to close the gap, this is the simple argument that we put to people, if you want to close the gap, people need to be either in jobs, if they're of working age, or in an education pathway. If they're not in an education pathway, then the jobs that they are most likely to get will be in the Indigenous business sector. The statistics already show us that. The Indigenous business sector, therefore, needs to survive the downturn in the mining industry and the downturn in commodity prices and the recession that we're going into, and grow with the government procurement. So, in a nutshell, those are the findings that I've made that are of practical consequence in my industry partnerships as a result of 10 years of research. And when I say industry partnerships, I'm talking not only about great partners like Rio Tinto, Santos, Woodside, Fortescue Metals Group, the Australian Government and others. I'm also talking about the Indigenous businesses, members of Supply Nation, or the members of the new National Indigenous Chamber of Commerce, which will be launched tomorrow in Sydney by the Minister, Senator Scullion. One of the things the IMF said about Africa years ago and about the developing world in general is that you need diversification in business so that the locals don't become dependent on one major operation. And this is the problem with major mining, gas or other projects. So therefore, the government's announcement of its procurement policy for an Indigenous supply chain in the government spend is a critical factor in creating that business diversification and therefore providing the mechanisms for growth for an Indigenous business sector and Indigenous economic participation. So I don't need to bore you with the details about the gaps, but they are much worse than you've been told, because what the Close the Gap report does is crunch down the worst and the best to a kind of national average. And the worst areas really, you know, I said to Minister Macklin years ago when she took on her first job as the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, I said, Minister, seriously, I want to take you to some areas. They look like Sudan without the guns, okay? And she rolled her eyes, and then a month later, after visiting a few places, she came back and she said, now, Marcia, what did you want to tell me? I don't have to say this to Minister Scullion because he's been around for a long time. He was a fisherman across the northern coast of Australia. He knows very well what the problems are. The problems in some areas of Australia are probably intractable, but we must not stop trying. And really, my main message is jobs close the gap for a very large part of our population. There are people who won't be able to take up the jobs, but those who can will close the gap within 2 years by working in the mainstream economy. And Indigenous businesses have a role to play in that. The mining industry have been champions and the front runners. Other industries now are picking up the baton, and I acknowledge the very good work of the Business Council of Australia and others, of course Reconciliation Australia, but particularly the Australian government for taking the idea of the vocational training and education centres. There were, when I first saw the one in the South Headland, I thought, oh, this has got to be everywhere. Well, there are now 29 across Australia. The government's put 145 million into it. I'm being told to shut up by one of my colleagues. I will now, but we'll see a real change if we continue on this path. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. I could listen all night to Marcia, and but anyway, let me thank and acknowledge the Carlton Connection and the University of Melbourne, the traditional owners, and thank you, Marcia, for that kind acknowledgement that I may have mentored you somewhere in the past. I can assure you that it was a two-way street, and I'm sure it was a lot more painful for me than it was for you. And if anyone hasn't been shredded by Marcia, you know, you have not had an intellectual experience. So thank you very much for my education. And indeed, we do go back a long, long way. I'm going to show some historical images, and I'll get to them in a minute. My work career, I was an exploration geologist. I came from New Zealand in the mid-70s to Australia. I'd played rugby barefoot with Maori. I found myself in the Northern Territory, and it was a cultural shock. I just wondered what on earth I was dealing with. And of course I proceeded to break all the rules, ignore the advice that was given to me by my Australian colleagues. So I'm a New Zealander by birth and an Australian by choice. Got myself nearly killed, many times in some pretty dangerous situations in our camps. But anyway, and then somewhere in the course of all that, met Marcia. And of course, it was, oh my God, this rabid, mad Aboriginal woman, Marcia Langton, and we could, perhaps under questioning, we can tell some stories about that. But at heart, I am still an exploration geologist, and I worked for Rio Tinto for 35 years. I will disclose I have no continuing connections with Rio Tinto other than that they employ me to do difficult work in difficult places all around the world, not much in Australia these days, but as a freelance consultant. And I still think that perhaps my real attributes are a great physical stamina and ability to sleep on the ground, that's about all I can do. and I still do that, and I've just come back. Well, I'm doing a lot of work in Mongolia, and I've been working in Myanmar and Papua New Guinea, and lots of places. And so the last 5 or 6 years, most of my work's been offshore, and amazingly, the things I learned in Australia are now applicable offshore. So, Nick, your reference to innovation and social and political innovation that has come out of this great period of conflict are truly applicable in other parts of the world. Not just blindly applied, I have to say. You've got to contextualise and think it through slowly. And particularly I'm finding in Mongolia that it has a Roman law background, and trying to dignify and formalise the sort of agreements we have from a common law background in Australia into a Roman law background is very, very difficult. People just simply don't get it. So what I thought I would do, and I almost feel like I'm kind of taking us back, because Marcia's inspiring vision of the current and the future is, that we all want to get there. And what I'm going to do is show you some images from the past, because what's been achieved is all the greater for where we were 40 years ago. And I hope you'll forgive me for sort of reminding some people, or perhaps even revealing to some people, where we were 40 years ago and 30 years ago and 20 years ago, because it's very, very easy to forget. Generational transition happens very, very quickly. And I don't want to go down memory lane, but there are some things that ground us in where we are. And I always thought that jobs were important. And we started talking that language 20 years ago, Paul Wan, Yanina, myself, in Rio Tinto, and we're basically laughed out of the room. But we just kind of felt that was it. And so we kept going, and finally, it came to be. And at one point, in the height of the boom, Rio had well over 2,500 Aboriginal employees. It's less now, obviously. But I don't know the statistics, but I can assure you that the laying off of Aboriginal employees has been on a lower trajectory than non-Aboriginal employees, for a very simple reason. It's not because they're Aboriginal, it's because they are locally domiciled. And, the first people that get laid off when companies face falling margins are those who fly in and fly out and have all these other overheads attached to them, right? So it just makes sense. And I also rush to add that, I'm not advocating this kind of extremist, reach for the future, you've all got to get a job perspective, because I'm also have come to learn through advice from Marcia as an anthropologist, and I'm not an anthropologist, but people from time to time, I think Mars might be one of them, says, yes, but Bruce, you think like an anthropologist, and that's, a great commendation for me. Thank you. But that I've come to realise, and that the key to the future is the past and the present. You cannot explore the future if you are not founded in who you are. So along with the employment has been this extraordinary support for what we call cultural heritage management. And, we're not going to talk much about it tonight, but believe me, the extraordinary thing that's happened in Australia while I've been here is to see the pride in every Australian person's face and eyes about Aboriginal presence, performance, art, performing arts, Olympic ceremonies, the like. That everyone, when I first came here 40 years ago, everyone denied that they were Aboriginal. Oh no, I'm Lebanese, my grandmother was Turkish, whatever, right? But now, we're all Aboriginal now. And that is simply, to me, beyond the employment, beyond the economic participation, that is the extraordinary change that's happened in 40 years. And I'm an outsider. I was watching this from the outside. So let's just quickly explore some images. This is the blockades of Nukumbar. The hairstyles say it all. They ground it in an age. And I wasn't there, and many of you will not know, but this was one of the first great acts of blockade and resistance against drilling on Nookambah Station in Western Australia. I was working in the Kimberley, you know, just down the road, like about 800 kilometres, as we say in Australia. But this is from the mid-70s, and these were becoming commonplace. And then this is, and I'm sorry, an old Rio Tinto slide, but you know, by the mid to late 80s, and with the promulgation of Mabo, this was the coverage of native title claims in the mid-90s. So you can see why it gained the attention, you know, suddenly of mining companies. We were not going to be able to work on the land that was under claim. The Northern Territory, by the way, should all be blue as well. I mean, the fact that it's not blue is because it was Aboriginal land rights, you know, a much stronger form of tenure than native title. So now, you know, that kind of imagery can be cast by the doomsdayers and the naysayers as, oh my God, we'll all be ruined, you know, we'll all be ruined because, you know, the black hand of Aboriginal People's Republic of whatever, you know, was going to take over. But the optimist amongst us, you know, was saying, well, no, hang on, this is just another form of strata title, you know, let's deal with it and let's work with it. And I was fortunate to have a CEO at that time of Leon Davis who made some pretty extraordinary statements and said, no, we're going to work with this and we're going to deal with it constructively. So as a young geologist, one of my first projects when I was managing things was the Kintyre project in WA. It was described as a 3-act nightmare. The 3 acts were Aboriginal claims, national park and uranium. Let's not go there tonight, that's a whole other subject. But this is, you know, what I was faced with. And, you know, of course, I was conflicted. I would fall back to sort of, oh, why can't people understand science? You know, I mean, at the end of the day, we've all just got to do this, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, Marcia or someone else would take me aside and whack me around the head, you know, and say, no, think beyond, you know, your training and what you're used to. And we were under the Carmen Lawrence government. We had a moratorium. It was brought down. We couldn't explore. We couldn't get land access for about 3 years. And then gradually, you know, I reached out to a few of the traditional owners, Teddy Biljabu, Brian Sampson, they're still around. And, you know, we started to talk like human beings and understand each other's perspective, but we still weren't going to get anywhere until there were formalised treaties and agreements and the like. Anyway, 20 years later, same group of people, same project, same part of the world, and those were the headlines we were being met with. So we had all learnt, you know, by then to more than accommodate each other. We had actually learnt that economic participation, respect for local environmental values, and a deep and abiding respect for cultural heritage values would see us all into the future. And we went, you know, there were quite a number of instances. I am going to use Rio Tinto examples because I know them best, but there's an old photograph from 1975. It attempts to portray that armed insurrection was just around the corner. I mean, they were all going kangaroo shooting or something, but, you know, what the extremists and the propagandists will put up with. But nevertheless, you know, people were angry. I don't want to play it down. And 20 years later, or 30 years later, you know, people are now working for us, right? And let me actually just take time out to reflect on what it means to be working and receiving money from, it doesn't matter if it's a mining company or Telstra or whomever, right? The quantum of rents that are paid into government or into local benefits receiving associations have nowhere near the quantum nor the impact that money going into households has. You know, I think maybe Argyle Diamond Mine, as one example, pays somewhere between $1 million and $2 million a year into benefits receiving trust. At the peak of its Aboriginal employment, it had 200 local Aboriginal people, you know, receiving $80,000 a year. Do the math, you know, it's $16 million, right? So there's an order of magnitude more money going into households. But the critical thing is money into households is usefully spent. By and large, households spend their money usefully, right? They put clothes on the kids, food in the fridge, send their kids to school. You know, it's a bit of a pick and a poke when you put money into a government institution or pay taxes. You know, I mean, my experience is that households are way better at managing money and doing effective things with it than bodies that receive it en masse and are governed by bureaucrats of whatever form. So this impact is 10 times, 100 times more impactful. It's not just the dollars. And thence onto broad-based economic development. Because if $2 million goes into a benefits receiving trust and $16 million goes into households per annum, then there's $200 million per annum going into businesses and into, you know, what used to be called the multiplier economy. And I'm testament to that. I mean, I see the stuff all over the world and how households and people spend money sensibly. Yes, there's always one bloke in 100 or 4 blokes in 100 who are drunk and abandon their families or whatever, but by and large, money into households makes things happen. So although I was a fledgling believer in this employment and business development, you can forget everything else. I now believe it way more than anything that I ever believed before. Look, another example, Gove, around for a very, very long time. The longest running, deepest, unresolved issue, the place where land rights started, and ironically the place that never got solved, right through until only 2 or 3 years ago. Images of Galarrwuy and the Bark Petition, which is now part of the regalia of the Parliament House of Australia. Bob Hawke, receiving the Barunga Treaty. This is iconic to the development of Australia as a nation. And when Rio bought into it 4 to 5 years ago, I had an important role to play to convince the leadership of Rio Tinto Alcan that we would never move forward in that place until we went back and addressed the deep underlying malaise of that original injustice. And Marcia was a great help to me in that, and a person who internally advocated for that, and we did it. So these things are very dear to me, and I'm going to shut up now, but I'm not saying we have the problem solved in Australia, but I'm an old exploration geologist. I'm just sort of perennially impatient and curious, and I'm now working mostly offshore, and I can tell you the things that we have learnt in Australia on how mining companies and resource extractors and other companies and the nation as a whole can work with land-connected Aboriginal peoples is utterly applicable elsewhere in the world, and I'm applying those learnings. It's slow, it's been slow in Australia, but like Australian medical research, like technology advancement, like financial innovation, like many other things, this area of social innovation exemplified by the capturing of the learnings in the ATNS database and website, which I refer to frequently and I refer to my colleagues constantly, is another area of extraordinary Australian endeavour. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners. As I stand here over in Melbourne, having just arrived from Perth this morning, I'd like to thank Professor Marcia Langton and Adjunct Professor Bruce Harvey. And I'm Damo. No professors, no doctors, nothing. And this is the only bag of fruit I own. And it's my second pair of shoes since the ones I got married in. So I'm really the newbie on the block. And I have copped a bollocksing from Marcia in 2007. Thank you for that. It has driven me to sit right alongside you, and I've really, I think that's the reason. One of the reasons I am here today is to be on a panel with you, because you do inspire me, and you too, Bruce. Looking up on the website about yourself, that you guys are the forebears of what we're doing, what I'm up to, and what I'm doing. It's interesting working for Andrew Forrest. I never thought I'd find myself in a mining company. I had dreadlocks, and I used to teach organic gardening in remote Aboriginal communities and walked around in board shorts and refused to wear fluoro. But then I realised that barking at mining companies wasn't really going to change anything. And so I had to get inside one to make a difference. And I think Andrew was a bit of an odd cat, for those who don't know him. But when I got interviewed, my mate found the iron ore at Fortescue back in 2004 or whatever it was. And Andrew Forrest interviewed me. He said, "Oh, so what have you done?" And I said, "Oh, I went to Teachers College and I worked on the drilling rigs and I did my teaching practice at Clontarf and a youth." "No, but what have you built?" I said, "I built a skate park." He goes, "How'd you do that?" I said, "I got some money from the Shire, I got some money from Lotteries West, and then I sold a metre of cement to all the little businesses in town for $140, and they all got a little plaque." He goes, "Well, think of this as one big skate park, you got the job." And here I am 9 years later, having been the VTEC Development Manager, and I've developed the VTEC program, which is now all around Australia. There's 29 of them. And it's those sort of risks on different people in business, I think, that you need to take, and you need to take risks, because if you don't, you're just going to put the same thing in, you're going to get the same thing out. So, actually, this is the story of Fortescue Metals, from conflict to collaboration. We were talking about it, thinking, and we still have some conflicts around the place, but when we walk into our native title agreement meetings, and I remember my mate, the GO, he said, "Oh, hey, I've got to meet the TOs. And what am I going to do?" I said, "Well, I bet you got to meet them. I bet you would have had 3 pies at the servo and 2 iced coffees before you even got there. So don't just rock up expecting that everybody else has got a pocket full of money and has sorted themselves out. So when you get there, say you're going to be there tell everybody the meeting starts at 10. Be there, with a barbecue, with cool drinks. If you're going to have them, make sure you've got Coke Zero, because people with diabetes is rife throughout the Pilbara. Feed everybody first, then sit down in the riverbed and then have your conversation." And that's where we started the VTEC program. And I learnt that in Roebourne, that all the conversations happen around a barbecue or a meal. And so we kicked off Fortescue basically, a quadrangle on a barbecue. I've cooked a lot of barbecues. Anyway, we've got land access agreements with these native title partners in the Pilbara, the Garriara, the Near Bali, the Balku, the Nyamal, Madu, Injbundi, Bunjama, Eastern Guruma, and we all say PKKP because I can't even say it. But I was just saying the other ones just to show off. But this is great, because this is where Eddie Marbo, this is what he's kicked off, because we've got that interface from day one. We have to sit down and have a chat. We can't just walk in the door and do what we like. And I think really, I've been up in Roebourne. I've been going back to Roebourne now for 15, 17 years now. I still go back there on a regular basis, and I'm on the school board, and I'm on the TAFE board, and I've been given the skin group, but it's one of those things that those relationships have to be long-term relationships. You can't just walk into places and expect to walk out next week with your whatever you want to achieve. So for me, being a Wadgler, it's different, but it takes trust. It's something that you got to earn, and it takes being there for a while. I mean, Bruce would nod his head to that one. Just walk in the door and walk out. So anyway. This is what we do. I don't even know what's on these slides because I sent them over. I didn't really have a preview. But our Aboriginal Engagement Centre, we've got the VTECs, we've got our business development and our title, our heritage and our 5-star. That's our sort of our leadership stuff. That's our university and school scholarships. Our land access, there's some stats currently we're at 12.5% direct Aboriginal employee, and that is actually still 600. And the bigger number of 1,000 was actually 1,200. That was combined with our contractors. And we're going through this turmoil at the moment, and we're actually looking how we can support the people we've committed to through our native title agreements the best. So they get priority, because this is what the business has signed up to do. You can't just say, well, thanks for we needed you when we needed you to get the hole in the ground, and now we don't need you anymore. It doesn't work that way, because the relationships, we've still got to go and turn over dirt for another 20 or 30 years. So you don't want to be burning your bridges and then turn around and knock on the door next time. So our wages to Aboriginal employees, and that includes our contractors, $130 million. And then there's the contractors down the bottom. That's because you talked about the 3%. Heath Nelson, who runs our billion opportunities, we have $1.6 billion in contracts to Aboriginal-owned businesses, and you'd know all about those, Marcia. So VTEC, established in 2006, so I've been coming up to 9 years now at Fortescue. We've trained and supported over 1,500 people. It's a holistic model. Guaranteed jobs is a big thing. Port Hedland, Roebourne, Perth and Fitzroy Crossing, we've got a program out there. It's Before I did this job, I was a youth worker in Margaret River, and before that I was living in Roebourne. I don't know if you know Roebourne and Margaret River, but you could probably think they're at probably opposite ends of the spectrum. When I got to Margaret River, I found there was some similar issues to what was going on in Roebourne. There wasn't the multiplier effect, there wasn't the depth, there wasn't, people didn't have one or two, they had one thing maybe going on, but in Roebourne they had 2 or 3 things, and it's been going on for longer. And a lot of these youth, I was a non-for-profit, had 32 programs, but we weren't allowed to talk to them. The housing people couldn't talk to the health people, who couldn't talk to the driver's licence because all the confidentiality within all these separate programs that were government funded. So you just dealt with people on that face, and then you had to tell their whole story again over there to the next person, tell the whole story again. So by the time they got around the room, they'd had a gutful, and basically they didn't get much solved because we're just doubling up. So what we did, we tried to do it all. And the word holistic was bandied around, uni a lot, but to actually put it into place it does work. If you actually use it for what it is. So the first thing we do, the person in the middle, you talk to their family, put clothes on their back, we see where they're sleeping, make sure they've got food in their stomach before you have a conversation. Then we check out their health, and it's a good opportunity for us to check out people's health. We use it for the mining industry, but we've prevented people's long-term illnesses by giving them opportunity to get a health check, but also to then re-engage them back into the local medical service. We've got a driver training program, and then we do some work experience, and then finally we get around to the training. We've got an MOU with the Department of Transport, we've got an MOU with the local health providers, we just did an MOU with the Department of Corrective Services. So we're using all these, this is going back to the skate park, getting everybody else in. Everybody else has got a part to play. I can't do it on my own. So when I first started, I got a bit of a kick around the ears because this is not a strengths-based approach. You're talking about everybody's problems and all the rest of it. But the fact is, when I mentioned non-for-profit to some of the people in Fortescue, they said, what? What do you mean non-for-profit? I've never heard of non-for-profit. We don't do anything unless there's a profit. And then I said, well, people said, just train these guys and get them out the door. I said, well, before I train them, there's a few things I've got to work on. Where are they sleeping? What are they eating? Have they got a licence? Have their health up to speed? Have they got clothes on the back? And so it went from, training to like looking at the barriers and identifying, people's issues. And most of the people in the Pilbara were sitting around here because Rio Tinto had employed all the other ones. Not true. But we got a few. But then we came in, and now we're dealing with people further and further down because there'd been a concerted effort around BHP, Rio Tinto, Woodside. I mean, I worked with Rio Tinto, with Larry Kickett back in 98, 99. So this is the reality when you're going through, and we had a community that had been severely impacted by mining, back in the early 60s, where there was, large amounts of alcohol, and then there was no. Schooling was of a minimum. The people who got to access education, stuff like that. There was just these two worlds collided in the Pilbara. These two timelines around the 1960s, late 1960s, that had created an area that was. I mean, if you have been to Roebourne, you've got to watch Exile in the Kingdom if you ever want to see a movie that can explain some of this sort of stuff. But this applies to Margaret River as well. It applies to the non-Indigenous kid down in the southwest. So this is where the VTEC is. We look at all these issues. So it recognises that the people have some issues. So then, after they come out of training from in the TAFE, where we look at the barriers, we do a little bit of training. We then take people out to the site where they do another 6 months, look a traineeship and into mainstream role. But the thing is, everybody's got a job. If you get in, there's a job at the end. And I think our retention rates went from, say, 66% to 100%. Everybody only started the course because they knew there was a job at the end. It stopped that training for the sake of training. It's a bit like, when you're a school teacher or a youth worker or a TAFE lecturer, you get somebody all sorted and you go off in the big wide world, here you go. And they walk out into some business that's got no idea of understanding Aboriginal people, they've got no idea of where this person's come from, and they come back, injured, winged. It's a bit like a bird that flies into the wall every time you set it free and you bandage it up again. It's when I was a youth worker, I found that the businesses didn't understand. Now with the Australian Employment Covenant, the business has actually been prepared for these people, and they actually got some buy-in. They're actually saying, yes, we've got a job, and we understand the young person that's coming through. I think at the moment there's 317 or maybe 325 businesses around Australia that have committed to jobs, and that's what the VTECs are there too, to link up the business with the young person before, and after, and that's critical. So I won't keep going because I know that people got some questions, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I mean, we originally sort of conceptualised, sort of a panel sort of Q&A, but the reality is that the issues are so complex and so vast, and it's important to get some background and context. And I think what we've seen tonight is, three sort of separate journeys, along that pathway, and it's pretty. I agree, completely inspiring work. So we're going to open this up for some questions. I'd like to hear some war stories as well. I'm also mindful of the need for refreshments as well, so cognizant of the time. But I might open, if I can take the moderator's privilege, and take you back to the Mabo decision in '92, and I believe there was a report that I sort of skimmed through. The sky did not fall in, in the context of that decision, and you were sort of referred to it before. But CRA, which became Rio, was apparently the first mining company to act. So I'd just like to ask you both, what was going on at that time, and maybe a couple of war stories from there, and then we'll take some questions from the floor.
Well, perhaps I'll kick off by saying that some of us, particularly those of us in the exploration division, had been arguing for a more enlightened approach for 10 years. Exploration was was the group that was being locked out of being able to do its business because of what we might now refer to as the land rights wars. So, it had taken huge efforts and a lot of time internally to get senior management into an enlightened position on this. I can remember as a young geologist being told by my executives, these people have got no right to be there, just, get a bigger bulldozer and that'll be it, and I used to think, well, hang on, that's not right, but, perhaps more importantly, it's not going to work, that's just a stupid business strategy. And then Leon Davis, when he took on the role of CEO in 1995, just literally broke the paradigm. Now, that didn't make everything come good overnight, because you've got what I refer to in corporations as the clay layer. It's all very well for the CEO to have this intellectual breakthrough and look at the enlightened self-interest and make a... And Leon used to say, well, I'll just write a memo, and you'd almost laugh in his face as if that's going to do anything. So there was a lot of work to actually get to after that. But Leon broke the doctrine. He broke the dogma by those headline statements that he made, which, when you read them at face value, they don't actually say much. There's nothing revolutionary in them. But believe me, at the time, the nation stopped, for 24 hours. I believe that Leon received phone calls from people you wouldn't believe, who told him he was a traitor, he was un-Australian, there was da-da-da-da-da.
Because he said... What did he say?
Well, he said, we're now going to treat with Aboriginal people as business partners, and we're open-minded, and I accept the basic tenets of native title. And, it's as simple as that. But it took another 10 years to really get traction. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that it was just suddenly like you click your fingers and it all comes good. And I don't know, how it looked from the Aboriginal perspective, but Marcia, I'd be interested to know.
Okay, so when the Mabo decision was announced, it took about 24 hours for the implications of the High Court decision to be broadcast. And the first interpretation of the High Court's decision was utterly hysterical and actually quite wrong at law. So the lawyers for the pastoralists, for the pastoral industry associations, the legal firms acting for businesses, the legal firms acting for mining companies, took the worst case scenario, and basically the industry had been operating on, the macho man view of the world, white supremacy, Aborigines shall, pass away, everything will be all right, they're just going to die out. And suddenly there was this decision that said, actually, Aboriginal title survives British annexation, native title exists, the Torres Strait Island community at Mayor have an exclusive right, you know, and the idea that that would become the case on the mainland sent them into utter hysteria for several years. You might remember, there's only a few people in the room old enough to remember. Hugh, Jeff, you're with me. You might remember the former Deputy Prime Minister, Tim Fischer, called the High Court judges a bunch of piss ants for making the decision, which is an extraordinary thing coming from a Cabinet Minister to criticise the High Court. You know, it is absolutely not the done thing in the Westminster system, but, you know, it was utter hysteria, and native title was on the news every day and every night for 2 years as a result. So basically, as a result of that, everybody in the country believed that the Aborigines were coming to take their hills hoists, were going to rape their daughters, and, you know, life as we know it was coming to an end. I mean, I had, you know, close friends, like, you know, university professors that run orchards as a hobby, saying to me, Marcia, does this mean I'm going to lose my orchard? I say, no, Philip, it does not mean that. You know, so a terrible climate of hysteria resulted, and it took about 10 years of negotiation to talk them all down. And finally, you know, the law is very clear. If native title is extinguished by an inconsistent title like a freehold, then it no longer exists. So the story's over. Native title might exist in part because you have a title granted by the Crown that only partially extinguishes the native title. So, you know, for instance, a pastoral lease. A national park, as it turned out later, does not extinguish native title, and so on, you know, so there are all of these gradations of extinguishment. And it took a very long time for everybody to calm down, and particularly, you know, we finally succeeded in getting the pastoral industry out of the negotiations. So they were funded by the Australian government for about 15 years to turn up and just be annoying, you know, to wear akubra hats and be annoying. They had no interest, they had no actual interest. Their titles were not affected in any way. You know, the law was very clear on it, but, you know, some lawyers were making a lot of money out of it. The mining companies, however, did have some very real interests to deal with, and unfortunately they were represented by some very poor advocates in the beginning. Well, pretty soon after our late 1993 settlement with the Australian government, there was a group of us who went in to negotiate. There was Noel Pearson, me, Wayne Bergman, David Ross from Central Australia, and a few others. We did a settlement with Paul Keating. That resulted in the Native Title Act. So basically what we did was draw a line in the sand, and we said, all right, the Constitution requires that you pay us compensation for extinguishment of native title going back to 1975 when the Racial Discrimination Act became law, but we'll forego gazillions of dollars of compensation, and we'll start native title at the commencement of the Act on January 1, 1994, as if the rest of history hadn't happened, just to be really fair to you white people. And in fact, of course, you know, being Machiavellian, to make it happen. Because without that kind of settlement, there'd be no native title recognised at all today. Now, the person who helped us make that happen, really, I'll have to acknowledge, well, of course it was Paul Keating, a genius, and of course the leader of the Senate at the time, Senator Gareth Evans, but another person who passed away some years ago, marvellous man, Rick Farley, and he was the CEO of the Pastoralists Association. What do they call themselves then? Pastoralists and Graziers Association. So that was the peak national body for, you know, all the cockies. Well, he grew up around, that's a country term for people who wear Kubra hats. He grew up around Emerald in Queensland, and I reckon he had a bit of, you know, Aboriginal ancestry, and basically he was just a very nice bloke, and he got what we were talking about, because, you know, if you grow up in central Queensland, and that's, you know, not far from my grandfather's country, you grow up poor, and you grow up the hard way. And he had no problem with us. He was not a racist, you know, he was just not a racist. He grew up with Aboriginal people, obviously, and he couldn't, like Leon Davis, he couldn't see the problem. What's the problem, you know? And so, actually, the critical deal was done in a lift. So the doors opened, Rick got in, and we all looked at each other and he said, "We can agree, can't we?" "Yeah, we can agree." And, you know, in like, you know, less than a minute, we said, "We'll make the starting date January 1, 1994 on the promulgation date, if you all agree to back off." He said, "Yeah, sounds fine to me. There's no problem here." And, you know, that's how it came about. But really, before that, there'd been 18 months of negotiations. So Paul Keating, Gareth Evans, even Cheryl Kerno played a part. You might remember her, Democrats, Senator, and, you know, a very good negotiator. There were a couple of Greens in the Senate back then, you might remember them. So to keep them happy, we did the Platypus Amendment. You know, they wanted, you know, justice now, revolution, etc. So we drafted an amendment and put it in the Native Title Act. To this day, nobody knows what it means or how to use it, but they liked it. And, sorry, had to tell you that secret. And once they'd been assured that, we, the Aboriginal traitors to the grand sovereign Aboriginal nation, those of us who were, you know, treacherous enough to deal with the Australian government, somehow it was okay for them to be senators, but it was not okay for me and Noel and Wayne and others, David, to negotiate, really did believe that, you know, and really did confirm that Aboriginal people had the right to cross pastoral leases, the right of egress, and that native title did in fact survive, as the High Court had said, in pastoral leases where there was no inconsistency. They were okay with it. So we did the Platypus Amendment to make them happy. And the Native Title Act then became a war zone. And it took many years to settle a number of technical issues that the first High Court in Mabo did not deal with. National parks, pastoral leases, good faith dealings, and I could go on and on. So there have been many, many appeals to the High Court, which have all had to go through one judge of the Federal Court, 3 judges of the Federal Court, you know, full bench, then the High Court, the right to hunt, you know, so many cases. And in most cases, the Aboriginal parties lost, either substantially or in part, and so native title has been whittled away by a thousand cuts and is now a very fragile right. And the best outcome, despite, you know, the state of the law, despite the statute, despite the common law, the best outcome is actually the binding contracts, of which Fortescue has 7, I believe. Rio Tinto has at last count about 30. Yep. And, you know, and then there's another 1,000 or so. Those...
Actually, and you know, you're absolutely right. I mean, the contracts, the common law contracts that have subsequently registered as ILUAs go way beyond anything that would have been contemplated under law, because the mining industry, you know, ever practical, said, look, we can't wait for the next 20 or 30 years for case law to determine every molecule of what this means, you know, I mean, because we have no idea. And in the meantime, all we want to do is dig a hole in the ground and mine stuff out and rehabilitate it to everyone's expectation. And so let's just sit down with the affected parties and put together a contract. And of course, that had the added benefit that you didn't actually start pulling in the caravan park owners and the bushwalkers and the hobby farmers who all said, well, hang on, I've got a say in that. And you go, no. Well, actually you don't, and you're just going to complicate the issue because this is a contract between consenting parties. There might be two, preferably three, bring the government in as well. And we won't open it up to all the world, which will just overcomplicate it. And then other innovations and just clear-headed thinking with the help of people like Marcia, because they would say, well, hang on, how are we going to deal with the extinguishment of native title, which we don't even know what it is? And then, we go, well, actually, we don't even want to extinguish it. Why don't we just agree to actually suppress it for the duration of the mining activity, and then when it's finished, it can rebound in its full extent to whatever that means. We'll pay compensation for the next 30 years for the temporary setting aside of native title. So we don't need to determine what native title means. It was just a very, very pragmatic approach, and I'm very pleased to say that people went, instead of nickel and diming, over definitional issues like lawyers would lead us to, we just said, well, look, at the end of the day, it's about recognising prior land connections, it's about environmental protection and integrity, and it's about participation in the economy. So let's just focus on that and move along.
We've got those agreements with us have got guaranteed jobs in them, a number per year from the native title groups, guaranteed business opportunities from the native title groups, not just monetary compensation. So there's that involvement in the whole project as well. They're part of those agreements, and they're evolving as they be changed. Yeah.
Paul Wand and I wrote the history of CRA's journey through this episode, and we called it quite deliberately and provocatively, "The Sky Did Not Fall In," because in the mid-90s, that we'll all be ruins in hand in hand. The nation's going to fall apart, the sky's going to fall in. Well, no, it didn't. It absolutely didn't. So if anyone wants to reference that paper in the Mabo 20th anniversary volume, it's available, and I like to think that it's a nice history.
It is. I'm conscious of time and need for refreshment. Do we have some questions from the floor?
Well, I'd say that you pay the royalties into a trust account, and it's up to the what that's been set aside for, maybe for education funds, or it depends on what they've set their trust up for. So we pay, and that gets divided between the native title groups. So they then apply to the trust if they want to send their kids to a private school, they want university fees paid, or if the kids just got drafted to the AFL and they want to go watch him play Greater Western Sydney, or it's up to the individual group how they spend that money. So
the trusts are owned
by the native title groups. So we pay into that. So it's how they spend the money. It's not my business. They have independent people sitting on the board of the trust. So
these charitable trusts are the preferred vehicle for the payment of native title payments from mining projects by the companies to the native title groups. Now, the reason why companies prefer charitable trusts is because they believe that charitable trusts will do two things. One, they'll accumulate the funds according to Australian charitable trust laws to create a capital fund for future generations who will not have access to the removed resource. And so that future fund, if you want to call it that, is the compensation to future generations. It doesn't always work like that because of Australian Taxation Office rules and decisions, but sometimes it does work like that, and we've had workshops over many years explained in this booklet to try to resolve those problems. Secondly, mining companies believe that charitable trusts are an appropriate vehicle for the distribution of funds to a group of people who are assumed to act as an entity for the good of all members of the native title group. That's not always the case either. So in any case, now there's a debate about whether or not the charitable trust should be the preferred vehicle, and that's discussed in this booklet, and I'll give you a copy. So we're talking about the problem of allowing Indigenous groups who have these charitable trusts to engage in the economy. It's difficult to use charitable trust funds to invest in the economy because of the charitable trust laws. So we've designed a vehicle called the Indigenous Community Development Corporation to do both of those things that it was assumed that charitable trusts could do. And we're, I think, you know, a fair way down the track with government to get them to legislate for it, to allow native title groups to have this special vehicle, to accumulate funds, and instead of just preserving it, to distribute it, to preserve it, to invest. So you would have seen during the week that there's a national intelligence report on how Aboriginal groups are being targeted by organised crime. They're targeting these charitable trusts. So it's really urgent that our recommendations are adopted by government, and they're all set out in this. So that's a thumbnail sketch of that problem. But beyond that, I think the point is that Bruce is right. The Indigenous Land Use Agreements and Section 31 agreements allow the parties to sit down and negotiate what was never contemplated by the Native Title Act or the High Court, and that is, what do we want this, you know, group of people, this place to look like at the end of the project? And say the project runs for 20 or 30 years, basically you're designing a contract to create a future. And people can work together and design a legal document, you know, that can set up the conditions for local economic development, employment, environmental conservation, cultural heritage protection, and so on. When I worked in Mongolia quite a few years ago, we tried to transfer all of our learnings from these processes to the local Mongolian people. And between me and two First Nations experts from Canada, we came up with 33 issues that need to be covered off in Indigenous land use agreements. So they're quite complicated documents, but it's like a development plan, and it actually, you know, by and large they work, and they work very well. Professor O'Farquharly from Griffith University, who we've all worked with, says that in his survey of agreements across Canada and Australia, about 40% of them are substandard. But that means that 60% of them are above standards, good standards, right? They're of good standard. Well, that's not a bad outcome from, you know, the terrible days of 1992 and 1993 when we were trying to negotiate the Native Title Act.
The big area of contrast that you've touched upon, and this is what I'm currently working on in my applied research, because most of my work is now in areas with a Roman law tradition, and I'm developing a view that you cannot have this level of consensual accommodation in a non-common law country. There's something unique about common law tradition that enabled the recognition of prior rights and prior land connections and prior customs, and I'm going to explore it and write it up, but that's what you're up against in South America. The fundamental threshold issues are just not there. There's a missing 1,200 years of tradition. Well, 40,000 years.
Question from the back, and then one more, and then we're going to take it to the social networking space.
Fundamentally, what people need to understand is these are commercial agreements, right? This is not charity, this is not voluntary work. These are fundamentally rigorous commercial agreements. And of course, within those commercial agreements, people are free to turn to whoever they like to get this very worthwhile advice from not-for-profits and World Vision and all sorts of other people. But, you know, it is, I'm sorry to say, it is not a space where the not-for-profits or charitable institutions take a lead. These are hard-nosed commercial agreements, and then we adopt in and take in and purchase from wherever all those who are prepared to help on a pull basis, but not on a push basis. I don't know if that's a pretty harsh comment, but yeah.
Well, I was very disappointed to see in the last federal budget the number of NGOs and football clubs getting Indigenous advancement strategy funding rather than the funding going to Aboriginal corporations. It's shocking. Have a look at the list. It's absolutely shocking. So, you know, Mission Australia, the Anglican Property Trust of Victoria, you know, have a look at the list. It's absolutely shocking. So I think the NGO sector has to have a big think about how they operate in this space, because they've moved in as shadow businesses to push the community-controlled Aboriginal sector out. And that is because that is what government policy is driving them to do. Government policy is saying, you know, we don't like the Indigenous sector, they're a bunch of drunks and pedophiles, so we'll hand it over to the missionaries. So along you come, World Vision, Mission Australia, you know, and you do the job because we can trust you. And I think it's a terrible outcome. I think it's disgraceful, and it's a real slap in the face for that part of the Indigenous sector that is well governed, efficient and competent, and has, you know, a long track record of innovation and a very high standard of service delivery, far, far better than some of these NGOs, and certainly far better than football clubs. So, you know, and I'm not saying the whole Indigenous sector is like that, but I'm saying there are some outstanding Aboriginal corporations in the Indigenous sector. And I think that the NGOs should be there by invitation only of Aboriginal people, not of Australian governments. Don't come in as the new colonisers, go in partnership with the Aboriginal people. Yes, the NGO sector should adopt the same principles as the corporate sector has adopted through Indigenous land use agreements, through reconciliation action plans, Indigenous employment targets and Indigenous business targets, you know, supply chain targets. Actually, you know, we don't need missionaries anymore. We need, you know, real economic engagement. So, you know, a whole new raft of NGOs is really not helpful in the end. We need real capacity building, and, you know, that's jobs and businesses.
Okay, so some lessons for all of us in that. I'm gonna wrap it up actually, and for people who have other questions, maybe they can take them offline with our panel. Before we thank our panellists, I certainly want to thank a few people, Charlie, the Carlton Connect team, Michelle, Philippa and Nina, Jaisal for some great support. Adrian Collette, Office of Engagement, thank you very much, University of Melbourne in general. And thank you everyone for taking an interest. What we try to do here is to sort of push forward the baseline knowledge of particular issues, and I think we've all taken a great education away from tonight. So thank you, Marcia, Bruce and Damien. You're welcome.
Thanks very much to you.
Welcome. And yeah.